Uh, it's been a powerful afternoon, really looking through these various projects from Akansha's to Sharmila's Open Circle to Pooja's 48 degrees. Um, I'm okay. I mean, I have some notes, but no, I don't need slides. They think it's too harsh. Yeah. I won't use ontology again. but, but I'll use the word typology. So if we really think of the typology of the various projects, I think the Kochi Biennial falls under a typology that's well recognized uh, and and almost gone viral. The typology of the biennial, which functions with some few vital ingredients and properties, which run through this category that we call biennials. First of all, there is a dimension of periodicity and scale. So there's always this imagination that sets out to become regional or international, but always with the city as the site. I mean, that's a tendency, mostly as a city as site. It has a tendency to recur, and it has a commitment to recur, and so additionality and time become the other kind of property. It also carries this other tendency to carry a certain descriptor which has to do with the location and also the commitment to time in its title. So you'll have the Singapore Biennial, the Sao Paulo Biennale, Shanghai Biennale as a site, and or the Yokohama Triennale, where it'll say it'll come in 3 years. So kind of, in that it announces something. But primarily, I think of biennials as a kind of fold-away deliberative assembly that kind of pop up and leave, but allows curators, artists, audiences at large to kind of cross-pollinate imaginations, exchange notes. I think have this open-endedness, and I think that's probably a function of the biennials that I think has let it remain still very active. As of the last number I heard, it was roughly 300 biennials in the world. And that's actually a bewildering thought, because even if they recur every 2 years, that actually means that every 48 to 72 hours, there is a biennial opening somewhere. So 2 years divided by whatever, it's crazy number. So hence I think this very relevant conversation around the fatigue around biennials, which also became a very much talked about thing. You hear it less now, I think. It seems to have settled. But I think in Kochi, the half to 3/4 of a million people coming to see the biennial itself set the tone for its own validity. That sort of justifies it. Also, perhaps because there's no traditional apparatus of the infrastructure for the arts, but there's great desire to participate in thinking and learning, and I think that really marries the two and creates this energy. But I think one element when we try to even think of biennials and even approach ideas of fatigue, etc., we also need to ask these other questions, which might be the who, when, where, how, and why. So, who makes the biennial and for whom? When is it made? Not just the timing when a biennial opens, but when was it conceived? So, very many biennials have interesting dates when they actually were envisaged. Where does it take place? How does it happen? The artisanal, the action, the craftsmanship of various people, from artists to curators to all the infrastructure and work that happens around it, and why does it take place. I think all of these would create another internal typology within this broad typology. And then it has this civic dimension, which allows for curators and artists to kind of think of this as a potential to upregulate civic consciousness, because you can populate it with certain thoughts and ideas, especially in a place where a lot of people come and go through the biennial. At one level, I also think of biennials as a kind of powerful de-extinction project. There are endangered ideas in all our notebooks, and biennials become a place to kind of reincarnate those, to celebrate chance, contingency, play, to have a commitment to the seemingly arbitrary, and investigative interest in the idiosyncratic. And I think all of these become, I think, again, very powerful reasons for us to continue both of us, Patrick and I, spoke at this symposium called Shall We Still Biennale? So it was used as a verb. Um, in 2020, sort of recapping, as Geeta just wanted me to go through this, the Kochi narrative in some way. So I'll quickly just run through it without spending too much time. In 2020, 2010, um, it all begins with a chance meeting between two artists, Bose Krishnamachari and Riaz Komu, with a minister, M.A. Baby, the culture minister at the time. And the minister kind of provokes the two artists to come up with an idea, and the artists sort of propose. So minister, provokes, and the artists, propose, and the minister commits. So it's really a Goldilocks story. It's like, it all happens suddenly. And the biennial kind of takes off. But we know the story thereafter. There's been long struggles. There's been, every edition has had its own turbulence. So I won't go into that. But right from the beginning, it's dodged all kinds of issues. Somehow the sort of first edition came about. The second one struggled to come about. And so all of that is another. I won't go into all of that. But as we discussed, biennials have these sort of naming with the site. But with Kochi, there's an extended middle name. So, you have Yokohama Triennale, but Kochi has Kochi Muziris Biennale, which I think is an interesting hyphenation. It has Muziris in the middle. And so it's probably the only biennial in the world that cites a location that exists, but also points to a location that might be from history or myth. And, that soft area that it comes from, I think hyphenates this project in a rather interesting way. The very first edition, when I reflect on it, had this really powerful civic-scaled artist workshop environment. Artists from various parts of the world arrived. It spread across this, I think, through a set of proposals that came through the naming of the Biennale and the announcement of the Biennale itself. This proposal to think about the cosmopolitan past and the present, but also a kind of a maritime sort of image, sort of went through the entire edition. And it kind of, and also the invocation of Muziris. I think these three things became really kind of powerful ways in which artists could enter the story and generate artworks in situ, on site, with material from Kochi. And that was really how I think the first edition really took off. And when I actually inherited thereon to sort of begin conceiving Kochi Biennale 2014, I think the audiences in Kochi had kind of accepted this story in a way that there was also this question that I would have from general, people that, will there be stories about the Gujarati community? It was almost assumed that the biennial is meant to speak of the city and about the city. So if I think about it, also, of course, Kochi had become an adjective. Since we are playing between nouns, adjectives, and verbs, Kochi had actually become an adjective. There was Biennale fish being sold at Old Harbour. There's Biennale juice on the waterfront, which is lemon juice. Bose Krishnamachari gets called Biennale all the time. So in a way, it kind of, it's reached a point where it had almost become like a floating adjective. And so to me, in a way, this was a question of how to kind of work through this vocabulary, and how to also generate a vocabulary as this becomes a biennale, because the first exhibition of any biennale announces itself as a biennale, it has to become one. So when the second edition opens, it actually becomes a biennale. And so to me, the sort of core need was to kind of upturn the optic in some ways. A very powerful optic of the first edition, but to upturn it, to actually turn it from being a view of Kochi, but to become a view from Kochi. And one of the first images that I had, even when I began, was this idea of the Biennale as an observation deck, as a kind of ocular device that you host, not as something that you invite to come and look at the Biennale, but look through the Biennale at the world, as a kind of way in which Kochi becomes a location in the world to think of the world. And I also thought that this optic could then be refracted and altered through other invocations and references and prompts that continuously emerge as one got deeper into the project. And to me personally, it was almost like a twinned departure, one going towards the age of discovery, 13th or 15th century. But again, that's of course a much more known narrative. But the lesser known narrative of the Kerala School of Astronomy and Mathematics, actively working at that same point in time, computing ideas of infinity, the calculus, trigonometry, all again linked to, of course, this journey. Of course, a long story, but you have how this mathematics circulates back into Europe and all of that. But at least to really think about the cosmological and the historical as a kind of way to think about the present through a world of smaller numbers that then becomes this large globalized world that also kind of arrives to look at the Biennale. I think I speak a little longer about the first and second edition because I think that's where this setting up of Kochi and the world actually occurs a lot more. But that then allows the curators that come in thereafter to take the narrative in a completely different direction too. And when I think of Sudarshan's edition, I would think that the optic was really not proposed as an optic, but really, as the title says, forming in the pupil of an eye, and really became a kind of celebration of different kinds of mediums in a way. You know, there's always this reference to performance and music and dance and poetry and literature as being kind of, you know, dispersed through the biennial sites. And then you have Anita, who then takes on and begins to produce a certain kind of a confrontational optic, if one might call it that. And I recall her on the 13th, actually in the biennial venue, actually saying, "Let this be a site for insurrection." So I think that becomes a kind of another impetus to think of the protest as a valid possibility to counter alienation, you know, and to think of inequity as a kind of charged space that you kind of, you know, you push against as well. So in a way, you know, Kochi sets out to kind of through the Biennale, through the audiences, through all of the founding figures and people, all of that, to kind of produce in some ways the idea of the world within Kochi. And I often think of how that would be transforming Kochi. I mean, I think, you know, like 10 years down the line, maybe kids can talk about, you know, how many biennials they've seen in their lives or something, because entire families come, you know. So, but also I think it's important to think in this current world how a transforming site like Kochi that transforms through the sort of power of art in some ways could be a transformative site for the people who arrive in Kochi as well. And I think that, you know, how do people feel when they land at Nedvancheri airport and then go through the Biennale and then leave, rubbing against life in Kochi and the tone and texture of how people, you know, you have to see art through over the shoulders of several people. And I think that's, an experience that I think an audience, I wonder from Switzerland or somewhere, may turn back into their own premises transformed. So I think I'll stop here for us to kind of return to our overall conversation. Thank you.
We could have easily ended at Jitish. And that's point number one. Point number two is that I might appear to the millennials and those who watch superhero films as Geeta's directorial sort of setup and me being, let's say, the proposed credit sequence. It's really that. I'll quickly dive into what I have to say, and I'll keep it very short, Geeta. Because मेरे को बोला गया था 4 घूंट पानी, 1 टॉयलेट ब्रेक, आधा समोसा और 12 मिनट. So, you know, I'm going to see how much of that. All right. Sorry, I'm saying. I have to apologize for that. All that solid becomes virtual. There are 8 slides. I'm starting with this matrix because people who don't know of my work, they should have some sort of location of where I'm coming from. So there are 8 projects. The first project starts in 2009. It's a project on Google Earth. And all the way till 2020, where the new project is actually going back into that mode of entirely becoming virtual, where the real site exists, but the real site now exists as an echo, which is entirely virtual. So these are 8 projects. Prajapati was the first project where I really started working with a physical site. It was a very large site. I'm not going to dwell on these. I'm going to come directly onto Edge of Sea Part 2 Twilight Engines, which is currently going on at the Marin Headlands in California. Marin Headlands is a spot which is in San Francisco. It's right across the Golden Gate Bridge. This part of California has a rich history in terms of coastal defense. Edge of Sea is a series of works which start started last year. One very quick thing, and I know many people in this panel have mentioned about certain key concepts of public, be it spaces, be it works, be it artists. Pooja said many things about it. Jitish said many things about it. Sharmila said many things about it. And what I wanted to add to that is that out of, let's say, this selection of 8 projects, except for the Shanghai Biannual, which was curated by Rux Media Collective, all projects were self-initiated. And if there was an institutional support or a private support that came in, it all came later. The problems that a artist such as myself who really wants to work only in the outdoors and with site specificity of a very particular kind. And that particular kind is that for me, if I'm working on a site, which is an outdoor site, and if I make a moment happen within it, then it has to be intrinsically linked to the site, which means that it cannot travel anywhere else. And once it's gone, it's gone. And that's what happens to most of my works. They're only there between 2 days to Shanghai was the longest, which was about for 3 months. But even for the biannual up in Sweden, I only kept coming back in cycles. The project was never available all the time to see for everyone. So going into Marin Headlands, this is the second site in the series of 7 sites, global sites. Marin Headlands, some of you might know of Marin Headlands because Christos did the running fence in 1976, and that came back to me because the older public which came to see my work remembered that one of the other public projects that was done at that time in the 1970s, 76, was Christos. The site also has a huge concentration of military abandoned ruins predating world wars. They actually start fortifying the coastal edge in 1890. The first big battery comes in 1920. So I lived on the site for about 7.5 to 8 months, 3 different periods. The project took about a year and a half. And I was living in military building, officers' houses, which are now converted into art centers and hostels and things like that. When I was there for the first time, I was reading Calasso's book Ardor, and these two really stuck out. And I've interwoven the two quotes. One which says that mind triggered through the most mysterious state, that in which there is no unmanifest and there is no manifest, producing something called an epiphenomenon. And the second one saying every sacrifice leaves out or leaves behind something that may turn against it, its site, its residue. While I was doing that, I'm one of my favorite, I mean, I remember this was 2017 fall when I was there. I listened to one of my most favorite of Urdu poets is Kaifi Azmi, and I often listen to his old Mushaira recordings, not others who have read his texts, just him. And I remember one particular nazm from Maktale Beirut, and I'll say why, but I'll just the first 2 lines which says that ऐसा बार लौट के किस शहर से तू आती है तेरे हर झोंके से बारूद की बू आती है. It came to me that he's not really talking about just the people, he's talking about a site and phenomenology which kind of comes and possesses that site or passes through that site. And most of my site works have been about going and possessing the site as the site has possessed me. Now, quickly getting into, this was a very large and expanded project, but I want to quickly run through it. This slide talks about how I now want to reinvent, not reinvent for reinvention's sake, not reinvent is not the right word, capture the site. Because I want to use the site for a very particular reason, and I'll come to that very quickly. But there are 3 sets of data that I collect of these sites. One, of course, the top one is the USGS, which is the United States Geosatellite services, and they make very high resolution data of land through satellite system. The second was the photogrammetry data of the sites itself, and the third one came from the declassified military drawings that are now available publicly. And so, for example, the photogrammetry data is data which is collected through photographs, and photographs then produce the entire three-dimensionality of that site itself. And if you can see, the middle slide is the data produced of the site, which is on the extreme left, photo mapped with its own photographic data, but it's a point cloud of surface. It's not flat. It's a three-dimensional object, which is also printed out as a 3D model. The reason why I wanted to do this is because there were two people who worked with me very closely for 7 months in developing proprietary software, which is written over base software for AR. And the reason why I was doing this is because I did not want to use data services, and I did not want to use GPS, because the work that I was going to produce was going to be only made to appear through mobile phones or mobile devices, because it was augmented. The reason for augmenting the work was very simple. I realized very early on that going back to negotiations that one has to go through when we are working with sites which are of such nature, be they public spaces or spaces for public, and there is a distinction there. What was interesting for me to know is that I would have to be dealing with National Park Services, because the site was under the National Park Services, which meant that I would be dealing with federal government, which meant that it would be really problematic. And thank God I didn't do that, because when I actually was there to put the project up, Trump shut the government down. The federal government was shut down for 30 days because of the Mexican war issue. So had I gone through the route of going through federal government, my project wouldn't have happened. So I said, I went back to 2009 and my Google Earth project, which actually was done at Code, and we did fantastic things at that time, all the hacking that was done. The fact of the matter was that I could still perform and make my idea appear, and I could cut many layers of negotiation, transaction, permissions, if I were to go through this augmented way. And that was an experiment I was ready to push myself into. Also, it was important to start learning how the devices that have become a part of our lives in a substantial way function when they can be pushed into areas where they not necessarily are developed to be in. And so, therefore, because it was mobile devices that was giving access to these augmented sculptures, the fact of the matter was that, and I didn't want to use data services and GPS, the architecture of the software that I was developing was on the basis of facial recognition. So I said that the camera phone, and here is where machine vision came in, the camera phone needs to identify architecture as some of our agencies identify us through our faces. So the camera looks at my face and knows that it is me. If I grew a beard, it might not do that. New iPhones, new mobile technologies, new access of both privacy and otherwise of recognition are kind of becoming more and more complex, where our faces or our retinas, more than our thumbprints, are going to be used. And I wanted to apply that same concept onto my site. And that made the software connect the site and the work in a way where they could not be broken apart. So from there, of course, I went into a second, there were layers of working with what I was working with here, because phenomenology was very important. Marin Headland sits in a very unique geolocation. It creates its own fog. Literally creates its own fog, and there's something also called the drip fog which happens, which is somewhere in the middle of fog and rain. And these are beautiful phenomena that my body could experience while I was there through the 7-8 months, that broken periods of time. Not just the fog, it's also geologically a lot of South California soil, rock, migrated all the way up to Northern California over millions of years and became this part of the Marin Headlands that we see today. And those things excited me to, a very childish kind of a level, where I was like, oh wow, this is all quite fascinating, which led me to start looking at magnetic fields and geological diagrams which the Earth produces, which are unseen, which are not really noticeable so easily by us, but they're all there. They're somewhere there, the geomagnetism of the Earth. It started with a previous project when I started interacting with space and atmospheric research institutes up in Kiruna for my Swedish biannual project, that how much these things affect us, how much the sun's impact on our magnetic fields makes the earth behave in ways that we don't want to, or we don't know how to access, process. So from here, now the diagram started forming the layers started forming and emerging. There's one diagram. There are diagrams that I'm doing with charcoal, which I'm trying to mimic lights, light particle, those kinds of aspects through. And then on the right-hand side, bottom corner, are the animations, which are code animations, which are now emerging, of how these formations will, what these formations will be and how they will perform. And those three middle diagrams are three sites, three very specific sites that I had chosen. It's a triangulation of sites. The middle site is called Battery Mendel. That's the site which is from the 1920s, the pre-war site. Battery Wallace are more bunker sites, which are on the left-hand side. They are closer to the Second World War. Then, of course, there's also a site which I don't have the time to show here, which was a Cold War site, because the Nike missile program, which was one of the most vertical programs of self-defense, was built in the 1970s and performed in the 1980s. So the again, a diagram where that particular, the topography with its photographic data is captured. That's a drone capture. That's not a manual camera capture. And then the diagrams that, the geodiagrams that then those sites embody. And then there is, of course, a very small slice of the code that you see on the right-hand side that is driving those. Every site that I work with has lights. This one has lights, but they're virtual. Every site within the code of light, which is built on metronomic meters, I always put in my pulse. And that pulse becomes the meter of the pulse always becomes a part of the work in a way where I kind of put myself in, that this was how my body was feeling while I was there at that site. So the lights and the metronomic meters, their swings and their animations all carry a part of that in their bigger DNA. This is what the app looked like. You were told many things, and on the right-hand side, if you can see, you're always asked to look at that picture and try to bring the camera to view that picture, because as soon as the camera views that picture, it's not actually it's not looking for a picture, it's looking for that area, because the camera is looking for that depth. It wants to look at the face of the architecture. And I gave moments of the architectural spaces, so that people could not be restricted to just one area. And architecture just doesn't have a face. It doesn't have just, eyes, and it has another language altogether. And those are the pictures that, the entire project, so those are engines. Those are the engines, the Twilight engines that appear at the sites. These are pictures sent by users, because I didn't take any of my pictures. These are all in-app pictures. Some of them are from iPad, and the longer ones are iPhone. And this is how they appear. Alongside the sites that one could go to, there were also these scaled models of the sites. And they also had the same engines in the smaller scale, in their comparable architectural scale, 1:50 scale models of the sites. Now, these sites, when viewers viewed them in the gallery space, looked very different from what you saw at site, because the site is overgrown, landscape has taken over. But these are almost like you pull them out and then you see, oh, this is what the engineers had planned to do in terms of when they were built. Sorry about that. It's just a bunch of clips that, again, people have been sending me. They're all animated diagrams. They don't just, they're not static. And the photo, I mean, having the function of recording and photographing was very important for me because the photograph then becomes a document of witnessing this event. It also becomes a document which then carries on telling us that this event happened, even though at site there is nothing there. You don't see anything there. They're vacant sites. Um, uh, and because and we are right across the Pacific, you see the Pacific Ocean. So every time of the day the light keeps changing, and every time you go there, it sometimes becomes a part of. It's more pronounced. The engines are more pronounced when it's a clearer sky. When it's a cloudy sky, then the engines kind of start working with the clouds itself. Every engine, so I don't want to go into too much detail because I'll run out of time.
We'll give you extra time.
Oh, okay. This is the most recent picture from the gallery that was sent to me when the exhibition was closing. I think the youngest audience member, 3 years old. Yeah, she's got an iPad and she's looking at one of the models on top of. Huh? I don't know. I mean, I was just quite excited to see this picture when it came in. But what I wanted to say is that about machine and media, there were a couple of points that I just want to throw out. So does digitality, these are questions that I'm also facing myself. There are no hard answers here, but so does digitality produce the possibility of the most radical definition of public art? An art post-human, totally autonomous, free to roam without any political or historical agendas, accessible to the public in some kind of radical otherness. Even the mobile phone is a random machine in terms of its distribution across demography, easily lost, stolen, discarded, exchanged. Thus, the residual physicality of the platform is also randomized maximally. And yet, this would mean that the human social or the human as such is now vaguely able to make sense of that which is beyond the historical logic of the human. Things like photography, medical imagery, space imagery, and so on. Imagery of spaces that were once unimaginable to the image are now within the human and thus within the realm of art. It is in this space of imagining and imagination beyond the conventionally human that digital art lies. The issue of medium becomes more and more dematerialized as we, as we approach the ghostly, the uncanny, as the realm of art. At most, we can say, now the medium is electromagnetic field. This is where paranormal cinema and digital art dialogue so easily, so directly. That was not possible earlier. And in this independence from human, will this, in a new public art, a new public Ganatantra, which is Gan as ghosts, here as goons, and Tantra as machines. So that's the logic I'm trying to present to myself.
Well, it's late as well as it's diverse. And yet, I mean, of course, Vishal had to be, I wanted graphically to have the 4 speakers and then have a space and then have Vishal. It was to be done graphically. You were supposed to be separate.
Okay.
So
I said you would. I said, Sona, that's your directorial framework.
Yeah,
so
you were going to have a gap between the 4 and you. So it wouldn't be difficult for me or for all of us to make a certain kind of configuration of the first 4 presentations. But at one level, it's very available. I don't think it needs a particular elaboration because they were conceived in almost an incremental spatial. They had a scope. They had a scope which was incrementally calibrated. And when I heard Vishal the other day at JNU, I thought that when I say out there, then we have Vishal truly out there, and it doesn't have to be discussed in the same terms, but he does actually bring it back to the public, to site, which is also related to real estate, as you said. So there is a global economics there. These are the warheads which have been active, as well as that the global is annotated very differently from the way that one annotates it in political terms. And so there would be a tension between what was presented before and later that is quite obvious. So I'll just want to open it out to the audience, and you address your questions to the person, and they speak directly to you. Thank you.
I feel like, I mean, the little that I've seen of your work in person, there's like a sense of not isolation, but a solitariness that I think maybe it's the space is maybe meditative in a way, in that these are like expanses that are abandoned, or maybe with the light works, at least what I saw in Goa, there was a certain kind of going into oneself. I was just wondering kind of what you, but ultimately these are all also when you're using satellite, these are all also human kind of models, and I'm just wondering where you kind of balance the body of the human and also like the space that is the site that is available to you in nature versus kind of what has been built, or that infrastructure or residues of infrastructure. That makes sense.
You know, the thing is that I didn't get the time to speak of that aspect, but Geeta did hear it at the JNU talk. The anthropometric is very important for me to engage with and respond with, because I'm not a char diwari wala person. I do not understand that, even though I have a background in architecture, but that's the thing that I want to break away from. And the more I break away from it, the more interest and knowledge I get of a scale outside of the human scale, which is, I think, what I'm interested in. I'm not interested in the human scale at all. And I think most of it, light becomes very interesting for me because it doesn't have a scalarity. I mean, it has scalarity. It has no fixed scale. I can throw the beam very long. Like, for example, at the Swedish Biennale this year, we were at the Baltic Sea, and I didn't realize how far the beams could go. So, and the airport is very close by, and I dodged the bullet with Pooja's JKK show, because I knew the airport is very close by, but I don't know how far the beam will go. So what happened there is that the airport chief called me the second day, and he said one particular beam is obstructing the pilots that are flying in, not the ones that are going on. So they said, okay, fine. I said, I'll reprogram it. But with JKK, it could have been, there were 8 of them going up. And I knew the airport is very close, but I don't know where it's going. I can only set a certain diagram to it, a very expanded diagram, a very sort of out there diagram. Unlike what you saw in Goa, which it's imploding, it's not going out. But from JKK onwards, which is going back to the Prajapati side, the DLF side, I'm outside, and I cannot measure that scale unless I bring urbanity to it, or architecture to it, or design to it, which is exactly what I'm going against. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Again, thank you for that very interesting and complex constitution of this also dialogue, because in many ways I'm thinking about, for example, what Sharmila spoke about, and also what Vishal is speaking about, you know, where also the public as a politicized form, and where Vishal speaks about the need to actually step away from any kind of you know, political or ideological overtones. My question to actually both of you would be, how are you looking then at the site? Are you looking at it as an ally? Or are you looking at it as something that you... Ally? Or are you looking at it as something that you're colliding with? Are you looking at it as a surface that you build upon? Or actually something that you work against, you know? I think this is a question that could be pertinent to both these very different forms of inhabiting the public space.
Well, that's exactly what one was trying to say through the presentation, that there is no one particular way of dealing with the site. It cannot be. And it has to be specific and particular, depending on how and when you are actually, you know, what agency do you bring to yourself, to the community, to the public, and to the site. So it is very particular, and it cannot just be pre-decided. And thereby, within that, one is negotiating all the time. So,
I'll add to. So I agree with Sharmila about one aspect of it. The site has multiple histories. It doesn't have one history. They have their approach. My approach is to open it as wide as possible and let others also come and get included in it. So for example, when I do the Prajapati work at the DLF site, I'm opening up a very private piece of land to public. There is a politics there, and that politics is hidden. I lure you in with the light object, and then I expose the site to you. You want to pick it up? You do that. If you don't, if people come and they go back without noticing that bit, that I don't want to push them into. And I also think that with sites, what happens is that sites don't belong to one particular time zone. The first time I saw the military sites, it looked like as if now, because the guns are gone, so once the guns are gone, then they start assuming they're out of function, but they're not out of function as diagrams. They're very much functioning diagrams. So I could see them as altar spaces. I said, acha, yahan seedhi chad ke jayenge, someone's head can be lopped off, blood will spill, and the whole ritual will happen. But it did appear like that. But there is a violence. What I'm trying to say is the violence is embedded. Gun नहीं है, इसका मतलब ये नहीं है कि violence नहीं है. वो उसका वो altar space लगने लगता है. So I need to understand that the oscillation is very much there between the very deep past and very distant future. And I just need to know how I want to include myself. Every line that happens, the engines are constructed out of these lines which are trajects. So the trajectory is the language that the site knew, which is, according to me, how I'm coding it in. So, but the thing is that the guns are gone and the trajectories were always shooting out. So now once that gun is gone, the site only knows the language of the trajectory, so it's only talking to itself. So all sculptural engines emerge out of that intercommunication. They're not communicating with anyone else now. That's why there's a solemnness to what he's also saying. It's solitary. There's no one to communicate with. And that, I think...
And manifestly occupied in the case of... I mean, that's clearly the difference. But also the fact that, if I may say so, the fact of juxtaposing this kind of a discourse would also generate some other possibilities of discussing site. And we were already, right from the beginning, speaking about the site. So the idea of site specificity, in fact, looks extremely lean and weak. It has had its history, but it would have to be amplified in very, very calibrated, very, very subtle ways in order to become meaningful again. I think that would be questions. Well, it's all right. We can have 1 or 2 more minutes. I just wanted to, if I might just bring in Akansha here very quickly, and quick questions and answers. You spoke about, you use the word hunger, and you say passerby. Now, clearly, to my mind, it immediately brought the idea of the flaneur, the person who walks and approximates a connection, but in fact is in some kind of a dream or a daze, and only half registers the encounter. So I thought you were in some ways invoking that. Just 1 minute. And I thought of Boris Groys defining the implication of installation art in terms of the fact that you make the spectator a flaneur, and by making the spectator a flaneur, you make them go to the object in some half relationship, in some half focus, but as a consequence of their going to the object, even if it is a copy or a photocopy, and much of what you had in your exhibition was photocopies, or original photographs, but copies of photographs, and of course objects. But they were from So, no, sorry to come back to my point. The fact that you walk up to them, even whatever their status as an art object or a non-art object, original or a copy, he suggests that the object gets reauratized. It regains an aura which was supposed to have been eliminated out. I thought that that is an interesting, I'm not necessarily asking whether this was programmed in your exhibition, but I thought that that could be one way of looking at it. Maybe you respond to that.
Yeah, I'll have to go closer. I mean, I have extensively, not extensive, that extensively, but one would like to actually talk about hanger in, elaborately, hanger for the passerby elaborately in a maybe whenever one finds an occasion to. So I have talked about passerby as a, of course it takes from Baudelaire's poem. There are so many references to the passerby in poetry. So Flanier definitely comes in, but actually I'm trying to, I have defined passerby slightly differently, but more as a commuter. More as a commuter with an agency and with a purpose, commuting from point A to point B, and in the everyday, and with the possibility. And as also someone who's in a way a kind of a contrary to witnessing, does not witness, does not have an alibi, and in relation to history has a very partial memory. So the passerby here in the hanger, the way it was operating was very carefully mapped in. So where passing by is also alluding to the artists and artistic practices, where each other's you become passerby to each other's practices, and that tangential approach, which allows sometimes to be frivolous, sometimes to be irresponsible, sometimes to be to gain, to create a large, much, and through that create a much larger circle and much larger ambit. And I think hanger did do that through its choice of materials and selections and the kind of propositions it was able to renew or propose, or kind of about the re-aura question. And about Boris Groys, one of the definite things, because I don't know why hanger kept being referred as an archive, as containing, because it of course was populated with a lot and it was trying to do a lot. Simultaneously, and speaking, from institutional histories to intersections between creating very large leaps. Making very large leaps. But I think what the methodology was the key. In hanger, the curatorial methodology was the key, and in that hurling, in that and that too treatment of each object, that aura and re-aura was being very specifically negotiated. So that's why it was not really an archived object, as even though it was a copy or not a copy or not a, so it was being displaced, deflected each and every single time. So, and it was being done very consciously by the viewer, for the viewer, as well as taking into account the places from where these materials were being sourced. Yeah. So I think that torque and that agency, and that's why the emphasis on curatorial object maybe, and probably, and I just wanted to also bring into not discussion, but just remind about one's curatorial trajectory, from the archiving the studio project that one did with Ranbir Kalika to the project that you saw, Zones of Contact, which I co-curated with Diksha and Vidya. So there was this section called Grazing in the center, right where souvenir shop was. So there seems to be a vocabulary developing, and let's see where it goes. Yeah, thanks.
Well, then I'll just wrap up with just pointing out what I thought was Jitish's position, which he actually lucidly positioned not just the idea of the Biennale and its fatigue as well as its reinvention. And we would like to believe in India that Kochi Biennale is a reinvention. Reinvention not just because it happens to be in our country, but there is some kind of an immanence in this site and in this project, which has changed and touched us in India, but I think a very large number of people, and that needs to be defined, but does not need to be defined also. It has done something which is created a kind of frisson in the contemporary within India, which is very significant. He used the word typology to begin with and continued then to speak about, you use the word optic a lot. And it's interesting that you use the word typology, of course, is a graphic concept. The optic is a perspectival one. And I thought that you were quite judiciously using these two terms and encapsulating the experiential part of the Kochi Biennale like that. And in Pooja's case, we all in Delhi knew 48 degrees, but I was amazed to see it now, because the way this city was in a sense, see how Open Circle occupied Bombay is what I refer to Sharmila to, of course, activist, agitprop in the historical sense of the word agitprop, and then completely punctual to the moment, to the times. In Pooja's case, because it was embedded in the notion of ecology and environment, it had a kind of universality, and you had international artists, so it addressed a universal issue. So I just thought that we've actually managed in this panel to have marked spatiality itself in very different ways. And maybe Jitish or Pooja have something to say, and then we close at that. I use the word typology and optic. Yes.
Well, maybe I'd talk about Pooja's project. No, I think because, I think in the manner in which it sort of talked to the climate at large, I think it was very, very powerful. I remember being very moved long distance, because I just knew about it through pictures and through I didn't see the project. But it just seemed, like Geeta said, all the more powerful now when you look at it in time, and also the fact that it kind of addressed, and I think the incredible works as well. I think, that the way it kind of opened up sites, it opened up conversations beyond, as Geeta also mentioned, that particular location. I mean, it almost also announced the fact that it's not just going to be a temperature crisis, but a air pollution crisis, like 10 years prior. So I think it really called for this kind of climactic alertness that Delhi and so many other cities need to alert themselves about. And I think that's really powerful. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
If I can make one small comment on that, just to add to that, I think among all the presentations in this panel, particularly, I think the idea of scale, or the question of scale, opens up very immersive pockets, and entries. So it's not the site exactly, but it's also the scale within which the immersion is, the pockets. Yeah.